The lake shimmered under the morning sun, casting golden ripples that danced across the calm surface. For years, that view had been my sanctuary, the reason I built my $2.5 million boathouse right on the edge of Crystal Bay. It wasn't just a structure. It was a dream carved into reality, every inch of polished oak, every glass window reflecting the peaceful horizon, every sound of water brushing against the dock. Life in the gated community of Cedar Point Shores was supposed to be perfect. The homes were expensive, the lawns immaculate, and the neighbors, well, let's just say they pretended to be civilized. But underneath that thin layer of perfection was an ugly truth, a homeowners association drunk on power. They controlled everything. The color of your mailbox, the size of your shrubs, even how long your car could be parked in the driveway. For a while, I played along. Paid the fees. Attended the meetings. Smiled politely when the HOA president, Marjorie Benton, lectured everyone about maintaining property harmony. But things changed the moment I finished my boathouse. It was a masterpiece. A two-story structure built over the water, complete with a private dock, a viewing deck, and reinforced glass walls. Local builders admired it. Even the architectural magazines wanted to feature it. But the HOA saw it differently. They claimed it was too modern and violated community aesthetics. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Then came the letters, fines stacking up weekly, complaints filed without warning, constant inspections. Every morning I'd find something new, a note pinned to my door, a photo taken from the street, a new notice from the HOA citing some obscure rule. I refused to bend. The boathouse was fully permitted by the county, and my paperwork was flawless. The HOA couldn't touch it, legally. But people like Marjorie didn't like being told no. Weeks turned into months. The tension grew thicker. My neighbors started avoiding me, afraid to anger the HOA. Rumors spread that my boathouse was illegal, unsafe, or lowering property values. I kept my distance, choosing peace over conflict. But that peace shattered one morning. It was early, maybe 6 a.m. I woke to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling down the private road. At first, I thought it was maintenance. But then I saw the dust clouds rising near the lake. I rushed outside, barefoot, adrenaline spiking. And there it was, my $2.5 million boathouse being torn apart, piece by piece. Excavators. Dump trucks. A demolition crew wearing safety vests with HOA authorized stenciled across the back. They were destroying everything. I screamed. I begged them to stop. But they ignored me, hiding behind a sheet of paperwork. The president herself stood at a distance, arms folded, smug satisfaction written all over her face. She claimed it was a community-ordered removal of an unapproved structure. By the time I reached the sheriff's office, it was too late. The structure was gone. Flattened. All that remained was the sound of water lapping against splintered beams. My dream, reduced to rubble. Days passed in silence. I barely slept. I couldn't eat. The smell of fresh cut wood made me sick. Every time I looked out at the empty shoreline, it felt like a piece of me had been stolen. And technically, it had been. But grief has a strange way of transforming into something else. Something sharper. Stronger. One night, as I sat staring at the ruins, I made a decision. If the HOA wanted war, they were going to get one. Not the kind fought with shouting or lawsuits, but something far more precise. I wasn't going to lose another thing to them. In fact, by the time I was done, they were going to lose everything. Because they hadn't just destroyed my property, they had underestimated me. And that was their biggest mistake. The weeks after the demolition became a study in control. While the neighborhood went back to its manicured routines and watered lawns, I sank into a different rhythm: observation, research, and meticulous planning. Grief had given way to a quiet, consuming focus. The initial shock was a cocoon now unzipping into something deliberate. I refused to let anger be the loud, sloppy thing that made me reckless. If I was going to take everything from the HOA, it would be surgical, public, and unavoidable. The first rule I set for myself was to gather facts. Emotions make for dramatic footage, but facts win battles. I pulled every document I had, county permits, blueprints, letters from contractors, and cross-referenced dates, signatures, and seal stamps. I learned the precise line between county authority and HOA governance, then how the HOA had overstepped it. I catalogued each violation they had committed against me: improper notices, lack of quorum on key votes, conflicts of interest where board members voted on rules that benefited their own properties. Each paper was a small, righteous weapon. Next came people. The HOA was powerful because it operated behind a social veil: polite smiles at barbecues, secrecy at meetings, and fear of being ostracized. If the HOA sat at the top of a pyramid, I needed to pry out the cement holding it together. I started talking to neighbors, not in the confrontational way that got a person branded the troublemaker, but in the slow way that revealed patterns. Stories emerged: inflated fines that were quietly distributed to favored contractors, hastily convened special meetings, where minutes were suspiciously vague, and private deals where the president's sister had been hired for landscaping at suspiciously high rates. The more I listened, the more the veneer of civility cracked. I recorded everything in an organized ledger: names, dates, amounts, turning whispered grievances into a methodical dossier. I found homeowners who had quietly paid fines rather than confront the board. I found a retired county inspector who remembered an informal phone call from the HOA the day before my boathouse came down. I found a community of people who were scared but quietly furious. That fear was a resource, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to transform into solidarity. Lawyers were expensive, and drama channels belonged to the spectacle of instant reaction. I refused to throw money away on headline-seeking attorneys. Instead, I formed a plan that relied on three equally lethal elements: evidence, exposure, and leverage. Evidence would be precise and irrefutable. Exposure would be public and relentless. Leverage would be legal and financial, aimed at dissolving the HOA's control without a single reckless act. Evidence required a drill down into the HOA's finances. The HOA, like many self-important organizations, had a tendency to keep ledgers that looked official but, on close inspection, had creative accounting. I filed formal requests for financial records under the state's Homeowners Association transparency laws. The board protested with flowery letters about privacy and community harmony, but the law was on my side. When the files finally arrived, it felt like someone had opened a window into a hidden room. There were invoices for community improvements that paid out to shell companies, receipts for services at twice the market rate, and a suspiciously large legal expenses line that coincided with the timing of my demolition. Patterns emerged like constellations. The more I annotated the records, the clearer the picture: the HOA was laundering influence through its own budget. Exposure needed a platform. I began creating a media strategy that would not feel like a wail of revenge but rather a documentary of accountability. My recordings of Demolition Day, previously raw with grief, were now intercut with voiceover narration, annotated documents, and timestamps. I reached out to local investigative journalists, people who prized facts and could move fast. I prepared a press packet that led with the most undeniable items: the county permit, the HOA's own minutes that failed to authorize the demolition properly, and the contractor invoices tied to the HOA president's relatives. When the first reporter called, it was as if the dam had cracked. News stories came in waves, each exposing another corner of the HOA's practices. Suddenly, what had been whispered in backyards played across local morning shows. Leverage was the quietest, most patient part of the plan. It wasn't enough to embarrass the board, their authority had to be materially weakened. I found precedents: other communities where courts had dissolved HOAs for malfeasance and misappropriation. I compiled case law, filed complaints with the state regulatory body that oversees homeowners associations, and prepared to petition for a forensic audit. I worked with homeowners who were quietly ready to press for change but lacked the leadership to do so. My role became the conduit, organizing signatures, coordinating sworn statements, and presenting a unified front that the HOA could not simply ignore or bully into silence. The social dynamics also required manipulation. The HOA's power depended on its ability to isolate dissidents. I began public outreach that framed the issue not as my personal vendetta but as a community-wide betrayal. Flyers appeared in mail slots, not accusatory but factual, summaries of what the records showed and clear instructions on how to demand an independent audit. I hosted small, neutral, information sessions, in my backyard, inviting residents who were still undecided. I emphasized the stakes. Transparency mattered not because I had lost a structure, but because everyone's property and rights were at risk. People who had been too intimidated to speak suddenly found vocabulary for their anger. Even as the public I trained on the HOA, the board tried to regroup. There were countermeasures, denials, emergency meetings with vague agendas, and attempts to rally loyalists by painting me as a troublemaker. But the documents and the timing were ruthless. One by one, dissenting board members who had enjoyed power in private began to publicly distance themselves. Neighbors who had once nodded in Marjorie's direction now asked uncomfortable questions. The sheriff's office took notice after a formal complaint revealed procedural failings on the day of demolition. An administrator from the state regulator made a courtesy visit, not yet an enforcement action but an unmistakable sign that the veneer of local control was cracking. There were unexpected costs. My privacy evaporated, reporters wanted footage, neighbors wanted statements, and online trolls misinterpreted my motives. There were nights I woke with the weight of being the center of a storm I had intentionally summoned. I wondered if I had started something that might spiral beyond my control. But the ledger kept me steady. Every new headline, every leaked invoice, made the plan more inevitable. The conspiracy that had once been a rumor hardened into a legal narrative. And when the auditors finally arrived, carrying clipboards and impartial faces, I felt both vindicated and exhausted. This was not the theatrical revenge some might have expected, no dramatic exhumations or symbolic burnings. It was paperwork, subpoenas, and slow, inexorable unspooling. Then came the turning point, a discovery in the HOA's expense ledgers that read like an admission. A large payment labeled Special Remediation matched the name of an LLC registered to Marjorie's brother. That single-line item bridged the gap between suspicious accounting and criminally suggestive behavior. Within days, the local paper ran a front-page article that framed the demolition as the apex of a pattern of nepotism and fiscal mismanagement. Residents who had been silent now demanded answers in public meetings. And Marjorie's smug posture began to crumble. The board made frantic attempts to reclaim the narrative, claims of voter mandates, ambiguous legal language about community aesthetics, but the foundation of those claims dissolved under scrutiny. 2 homeowners filed a petition for an emergency injunction, the state regulator opened an inquiry, and a law firm specializing in association law offered pro bono counsel for the community audit after seeing the public records. The leverage I had patiently built became a collapsing star. Its gravity altered the neighborhood's environment irrevocably. Everything shifted from private loss to civic reckoning. My grief remained, of course. Loss is not traded for victory without cost, but it was reframed. The fight was no longer about a single boathouse, it had become about the integrity of the neighborhood and the right of residents to be governed transparently. That shift made the plan righteous in a way that silenced internal doubts. Yet even with the board's image tarnished and audits underway, the most dangerous phase remained. The HOA, cornered, would attempt its last gambits, legal strangleholds, frantic fundraising to retain sympathetic counsel, and perhaps personal attacks aimed at intimidating key witnesses. I knew there would be a day when the fight escalated and I would have to be ready to press every advantage. I also knew that true victory would not be instantaneous, it would be a sustained process to dismantle the systems that allowed the abuse to happen. On a late autumn morning, as the lake reflected gray skies and the first frost rimed the docks, I sat on what remained of my shoreline and looked out at the empty space where the boathouse had been. The scene no longer felt like an open wound so much as a battlefield cleared for the next maneuver. The papers were organized, the witnesses prepared, and the community, slowly but surely, was waking up. The hoarding of power by a petty elite had been interrupted. The stage was set for the final act. The courtroom, the regulatory hearings, and the public confession of misdeeds loomed like a show with an inevitable climax. I had lit the spark with evidence and exposure, now the embers were ready to flare. The next moves would require precision, endurance, and the ruthlessness of someone who had already watched everything dear to them be taken away. The final act arrived not like a thunderclap, but as a series of small, irrevocable collapses. Once the machinery of exposure and legal pressure had been set in motion, the HOA could no longer rely on the polite inertia that had long sustained it. The neighborhood meetings that had once been perfunctory rituals became arenas where facts were read aloud, records were displayed on projectors, and faces that had smiled politely for years flushed with the realization that they had been quietly exploited. The board's defensive choreography, evasions, procedural smoke, and sanctimonious rhetoric, crumbled under the weight of its own invoices. The hearings began with bare-boned formalities, sworn statements from neighbors who had previously whispered their complaints in private, the forensic auditor's crisp spreadsheets showing money flowing from HOA coffers to private enterprises tied to the president and her inner circle, and county officials who confirmed that the demolition lacked the necessary HOA approval and the forms the board claimed to possess. Each document tightened the narrative like a noose of accountability. The more the board attempted to explain away line items and ambiguous minutes, the more obvious their improvised rationales became. Patterns that had been invisible in isolation now revealed a coherent picture of systemic abuse. Public sentiment shifted into a kind of moral velocity. Homeowners who had once deferred to Marjorie's authority now attended meetings with petitions in hand. A petition to remove the entire board circulated, not as a rumor but as a palpable force. The state regulator's inquiry transformed from a polite review to a more focused investigation, and a grand jury subpoena, calm, procedural, yet terrifyingly real, arrived at the HOA office like an executioner's summons. For the first time, the veneer of community stewardship that had been used to justify petty tyrannies could no longer shield individuals from legal scrutiny. Marjorie's isolation deepened with each new revelation. Her allies, sensing the risk of collateral damage, began to distance themselves. One by one they resigned or recused themselves from contentious votes, their names reappearing in records with signatures that no longer carried the same weight. The landscape of power in the neighborhood altered not because a single person had been vanquished, but because the networks that supported corruption had been exposed as fragile and self-serving. The small economies of favor, repairs to select driveways, contractor kickbacks, inflated landscaping contracts, were no longer harmless niceties but evidence. The community's legal strategy unfolded like a well-rehearsed campaign. Class action claims moved in tandem with criminal inquiries. The forensic audit produced a report with clear recommendations: restitution to the HOA's coffers for misspent funds, the removal of certain board members for conflict of interest, and reforms mandating transparent bidding processes for all service contracts. The legal team, once hesitant, now worked with a momentum fueled by an uncommon alignment between civic outrage and documentary evidence. Courtrooms are a strange theater, obedient to procedure, indifferent to drama, but in those rooms the truth steadily gained purchase. There were moments of petty retaliations, as expected. Anonymous letters circulated accusing me of fabricating documents, a smear campaign spun rumors about my motives, and threats arrived that were nasty enough to be recorded and eventually paraded in court. Yet each attempt at intimidation backfired, creating more evidence of the board's willingness to manipulate the truth. The sheriff's office, once a distant monolith, began to act on reports of coercion and voyeurism. The legal net had been cast wide enough that the board's remaining options dwindled to two: comply or collapse. Compliance took the form of a public meeting where the board, stripped of its usual posture of moral superiority, offered a halting apology that read more like a legal maneuver than contrition. There was no theatrical moment of confession, instead a cascade of resignations followed, some voluntary, others compelled by regulatory fiat. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen temporarily while restitution negotiations commenced. The contractor contracts that had quietly siphoned community funds were renegotiated under the watchful eyes of independent auditors and newly elected oversight committees. The community reorganized itself not as a hostile machine but as a collection of people who had been reminded that governance requires transparency. The restitution process was messy and slow, but it was incontrovertible. Funds traced through shell LLCs were identified and reclaimed where possible, civil judgments attached to assets that had been used to launder payments, and, in a particularly satisfying legal twist, the HOA's insurer balked at covering fraudulent expenditures, leaving implicated contractors and board members personally liable for portions of the sum. The legal victories did not fully restore what had been lost. There was no plausible way to reconstruct the sentimental value of sunsets witnessed from the Boathouse's deck. Yet the financial accountability sent a clear message: exploitation would not pay. Perhaps the most meaningful victory was not in the courtroom but in the way neighbors began to relate to one another again. Where fear had once silenced people, new civic norms allowed for conversation, disagreement, and reasonable governance. Committees formed to oversee community spending, bylaws were rewritten with plain-language transparency provisions, and mandatory independent audits were written into the HOA's charter. The neighborhood that had once deferred to social elites reasserted a collective power that was less theatrical and more durable. As for Marjorie, the arc of her downfall was as predictable as it was human. Stripped of authority and besieged by legal exposure, she retreated from public life. There was no dramatic arrest on the lawn, no cinematic collapse. Instead she paid restitution where courts demanded it, endured the humiliation of recorded testimony, and watched the community she once managed with an iron smile reorient around new leaders. Her allies, some ruined financially and reputationally, began to move away or lay low. The social order that had allowed for petty tyrannies reshaped itself into a system that prized transparency over patronage. In the quiet aftermath, the shoreline where my boathouse once stood became a place of reflection rather than revenge. I walked there often not to relive the injury but to witness the practical results of change: a small plaque recognizing community reform efforts, a newly planted line of native reeds that masked a previously eroded bank, and a modest communal dock that had been constructed through a transparent bidding process to serve all residents. The dock was utilitarian, nothing like the private, luxurious boathouse that had been taken from me, but in that ordinariness there was a kind of moral victory. The community had reclaimed its commons. There were personal costs that lingered, relationships strained beyond repair, the emotional fatigue of being the pivot around which a scandal turned, and an enduring sense of absence when I stood by the water and remembered the boathouse as it had been. No legal victory could return the exact smell of cut cedar or the tilt of sunlight through the glass. Yet in watching systemic accountability replace petty abuse, there was a restorative arc to the loss. The fight had been not merely a crusade for personal justice, but a reclamation of civic dignity for every homeowner who had been made complicit by silence. In the end, what felt like revenge became reparation. The HOA's authority was recalibrated by law and community will. Corrupt practices were financially penalized and structurally prevented from recurring. My personal loss remained a scar, a narrative wound that taught a neighborhood how to organize against abuse. The story would be told in years to come at community meetings and in whispered warnings to new arrivals: transparency matters more than appearances, and power left unchecked will find creative ways to feed itself. Standing on the dock that now served the whole community, the lake spread out, ordinary and vast. The sunsets were the same in their indifferent beauty. I let the memory of the boathouse settle into something quieter than fury, an ache tempered by the knowledge that what I had done had shifted the balance of power in a place that would be lived in long after any one of us were gone. The cost had been high, but the result had been just. The association that had once ruled itself without oversight had fallen, and in its place rose a structure of accountability designed to protect the many, not the few. The chapter closed not on a Pyrrhic note of hollow victory but on the steady work of community. That steadiness felt like a promise, that even when something irreplaceable is taken, it can become the spark that forces a community to choose integrity over convenience, transparency over tradition, and fairness over favoritism.